This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the thumb was engineered, the foot was deviled, and the Peter was black, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what a basket chair is? Or why Watson's medicine of choice is always brandy? Or what a coal scuttle is and why cigars would be there?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 186, Watson's Patience. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into some of the itty-bitty, nitty-gritty details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I must say, you very rarely try my patience.
Well, that's because they're all sitting in your consulting room reading old National Geographics. But you must come over and try mine sometime.
I shall. I shall. And I'm not even part of the legal profession. I don't know if I'm able to try them.
Well.
Yeah. Well.
You know, it's an ecumenical age. My patients are your patients.
Fair enough. We will share and share alike, which is what we hope you do with this episode when you find it at ihose.co/trifles186. You can share it with any Sherlockian who you think needs to hear it. And the more people that learn about the show, the better. One of the best ways you can help people learn about the show is to give us a rating and review. And of course, we are I Hear of Sherlock on all the social networks, and we invite your feedback whenever you get the chance. We're glad you're here, so let's get going. Well, you know, it strikes me that when we read the canon, Sherlock Holmes doesn't seem to be a very patient man. He puts up with a lot. He has all kinds of clients. And even after his brush with death and 3 years away during the great hiatus, he came back and greeted Watson, was ready to get out on the trail again. And Watson said 3 years had certainly not smoothed the asperities of his temper or his impatience with a less active intelligence than his own. And that to me sums up Holmes's personality fairly well, that he was very quick-witted, obviously very intelligent, and he didn't always appreciate that people weren't quite up to speed with him. But Watson, by the same token, was a very patient man. Look, you would have to be very patient if you lived with and worked with someone like Sherlock Holmes. So, in this episode, I think we'd like to explore where Watson's patience was tried and where Holmes might have had a hand in that from time to time.
It's a great subject. You know, I hate to start philosophically, but, Aristotle and so many of the classical scholars have written thought about friendship. And friendship, when you develop a philosophical underpinning for it, I think it was Aristotle who pointed out that real friendship exists, based on mutual goodwill and virtue. And it's very hard to connect Sherlock Holmes, who is a character who runs in his own rails, whose perception of the world is driven so largely by his own constant observation of small details and the conclusions he's drawing, his sense of how he's honed his own specialty, the many items that he looks for in catalogs, the things that he finds essential to his work. It's hard to imagine that he could find much room in his attic storehouse or in his character. And he certainly didn't have very many opportunities in his life for friendship. You know, he frequently, when he describes his early cases to Watson, he will refer to people that he knew at college as my only friend. And of course, Watson has been famously called by Michael Dirda and others, his only friend. So this is someone who's clearly not had a lot of experience in forming warm relationships. And that's been fodder for people like, Mark Gatiss, in the portrayal of Mycroft as an example, you know, his less than warm, less than fraternal relationships with his own siblings and so on. So, you know, it's not unusual to find the characterization of Sherlock Holmes as someone who's sort of short-tempered, who's not particularly tolerant of other people. And there are many examples of that in the canon, and a good one is in The Three Students as a good place to start, because The Three Students has sort of an aside, and it's very unusual. I mean, we will explore a couple of these other points where Holmes is less than charitable to Watson, or we can imagine how Watson might have felt at certain points. But in The Three Students, as the case starts, you know, Holmes is not. Well, I mean, just to cut to the chase, Holmes is presented with a series of strange series of events in The Three Students, and when he hears it all, he gives an enigmatic smile and says, "Well, let us go round. Not one of your cases, Watson. Mental, not physical. All right, come if you want to."
Boy.
Wow.
Ouch.
Now, I can't imagine anybody with whom I had a close friendship turning to me and saying, "Hey, Walter, all right, this sounds very interesting. Of course, you are going to be you want to come? All right, well, fine. Come if you want to. But this is clearly not in your league." You know, I mean, that is really, really rather remarkable.
Well, it is. And, you know, it kind of makes me wonder why Watson put up with it. Or, for that matter, why Holmes put up with Watson. I mean, yes, he threw these zingers out from time to time, but, you know, if his only friend was Watson, it seems like that friendship was dangling by a thread with remarks like this. And to me, it's clear that they both needed each other. You know, there was a transactional part of the relationship there as well. Obviously, they could use, the break on rent. That helped. Although as Holmes's career and Watson's too at a certain point, began to flourish, that became immaterial. But at the same time, Watson was Holmes's press agent. He was his front man who continued to publicize Holmes's successes. So I'm sure Holmes realized that. And for Watson, you know, being part of the Baker Street scene gave him an income when he wrote these stories. So, you know, each of them got something out of the relationship. And to a certain extent, I think that allowed Watson to put up with it.
Oh, I agree with you a lot. I think that's really very well said. I agree completely with that. And in fact, the relationship with Sherlock Holmes, you can sort of put the puzzle pieces together and think about how this might fit. There you are. Clearly, now Watson, we know from his own admission, appears to be, now a lot of people have speculated about this, but appears to be alone in the world. We know he has had an unfortunate brother whom is no longer around. We find from his very first words in the very first case of Sherlock Holmes that he is alone and friendless. in London. So here is someone whose background is a little murky, who appears to be completely alone, but who also comes from a posting as a military physician. So he's come from the army, and he is now completely without a community. So if you think about that, anyone who's trained as a physician has had, now admittedly, physician training in the 19th century in England was nothing like physician training in the 20th or 21st century in England today. But he's been in class, he's been in school, he's been with patients, he's been with people, he's been in battle, he's been with soldiers, he's been with comrades. And he's not, a private. I mean, he is a discharged military physician who's suddenly bereft of a community. Now, many people have speculated, and most frequently, I think it was Roger Johnson in the Sherlock Holmes Society of London's Journal, about what club might Watson have been a member of. And Watson, we know certainly Watson was a club member, and he did play billiards, for example, with Thurston in his club. And Roger's paper, I think that most recent paper did a lovely job of aligning Watson, with a particular club. So he's got that. But for someone like Watson to be associated with someone like Sherlock Holmes, surely this is ideal. I mean, first of all, there's no restrictions on his movement. He can come and go as he please. There's no, really demand on his attention. Watson is intensely curious about Holmes, and Holmes has a set of skills, makes a set of observations, sees a world that Watson is completely impervious to. He's unaware of it. So he finds Holmes very interesting. And then over time, they develop a close loyalty and a close affection for each other that becomes revealed, over the years. But it's absolutely ideal for Watson. And of course, some people have speculated about a romantic attachment between the two of them, which I think is fairly clear to be completely not present in the 60 stories. But time and culture moves on, and it certainly is a very active area of speculation.
Well, as much as there is this bickering between the two, I mean, you could see that between a long-term couple, whether they're romantically or platonically involved. So that makes a lot of sense. Well,
but the interesting thing is, why that particular slight in the three students? And we should point out that Christopher Morley, in his book in the 1940s, he put together a compilation, a book about the Holmes and Watson cases, and called it Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, a textbook of friendship.
That's right.
And so clearly the friendship between the two is really very real.
Well, we're going to pause for a real moment here for a word from our sponsor. Psst. Hey, I've got a secret. Lean in. You ready? Subscribe to the Baker Street Journal. And if you do subscribe already, tell someone else to subscribe. That's it. That's the message. It's simple. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com right now. We'll wait. The show will be here. Just go. Go do it. We'll be here when you come back. Okay, we're back. And, a couple of things. One, you were mentioning Watson's Club. We did an episode on that not too long ago. Trifle's episode number 130 on Watson's Club. If you want to go back and take a listen to that, this would be a great time to do that. The other thing too, Bert, was when you were talking about the three students and, Watson publishing, this account of Holmes berating him. My first thought was, ouch. Why would Watson put something in print that is so degrading to him, so degrading to him? But then I thought, well, this isn't quite so degrading to Watson as it is to Holmes. It is a damning character reference to Holmes. So Watson gets his little bit of revenge on Holmes's caustic personality by exposing him for the at times thoughtless human being he could be.
Oh, yes. I think that's a terrific point. And how interesting that in today's social media environment, more people tend to find more opportunities to present, apparently unvarnished, the inappropriate, poorly phrased, negative, possibly scandalous comments of people they're associated with, sort of as if to say, can you believe it? Look. Let me quote this person. Look. So we're lucky the cancel culture didn't exist in Watson's day.
That's true. The cancel canon. Well, let's take a look at another couple of instances of Holmes' thoughtlessness and Watson's patience during it before we get to Watson's final revenge. In the Dying
go ahead.
In The Dying Detective, this is probably one of the more famous ones. Holmes is there, suffering from this malady, and Watson, very concerned about his friend, insists that he allow Holmes to that Holmes allow Watson to examine him, and he says he looked at me with venomous eyes. If I am to have a doctor, whether I will or not, let me at least have someone in whom I have confidence, said he. Then you have none in me? In your friendship, certainly, but facts are facts, Watson, and after all, you are only a general practitioner with a very limited experience and mediocre qualifications. It is painful to have to say these things, but you leave me no choice. I was bitterly hurt. That's rough. That's rough right there.
Well, it is rough, but boy, oh boy, particularly today in the fantasy world of COVID-19, this is from The Dying Detective, obviously. And we know, spoiler alert, we know that Holmes is putting on the appearance of being poisoned and at death's door. But right before we get to this particular interchange, what happens here is that Watson is summoned to see Holmes. To his surprise, he finds him in this dreadful state. And Holmes, we will later learn, since he's putting this on, doesn't really want Watson to be too close. So the first thing that happens is, he says, he basically says, stay away from me. I've got this awful disease and it's horribly contagious. So here you are, with this contagion. And contagious by touch, Watson. That's it. So keep your distance and all is well. So here's Holmes saying, social distancing. And Watson's reaction is, do you think that a consideration like that weighs with me for an instant? It wouldn't affect me in the case of a stranger. How would it prevent me from doing my duty to so old a friend? So here's a rare moment where both of these people are talking about their friendship for each other. And then Holmes, drives him away, negatively in this passage that you, present. And so, but even there, he says, Watson says, you have no confidence in me. And Holmes says, in your friendship, certainly. So that's one of the rare moments where they're both expressing very clearly their friendship for each other. But then, he's got to have some reason. Holmes thinking rapidly has got to have some reason for Watson not to get too close. And so he chooses, you don't really have the professional qualifications to understand this. This is, you're just a general practitioner. And Watson then says, as you pointed out, I was bitterly hurt by this.
Yeah, it was, as you say, just a brilliant stroke of, I guess manipulation on Holmes's part. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't one of those callous offhand remarks. It was a very specific, phrase and structure that he used there to keep Watson away because he knew it would work.
Yeah. And Watson, the lovely thing about this, Watson, even though he's bitterly hurt, says, well, okay, Holmes, this shows me the state of your mind, but if you don't have any confidence in me, I can bring this expert or that expert, the best men in London. And then that's the last thing Holmes wants. So he says, oh, you mean well, Watson, you mean well, with this awful noise. But shall I demonstrate your own ignorance? What do you know of the Tapanuli fever? What do you know of the Black Formosa corruption? And Watson says, I've never heard of either. Well, because they're completely imaginary, but but it's, it's a lovely thing. So here's Holmes really trying to find reasons for Watson to keep his distance and therefore not discern at a glance that the thing is being put on.
Well, and then we come to the instance of Watson having his little revenge on Holmes. He's dealt with these offhanded remarks, intentional or not, throughout their career. When in The Missing Three-Quarter, Holmes received a telegram from Cyril Overton, who was, I believe, a captain of the rugby team. And we know Watson played rugby. He talks of his experience with Blackheath when he encountered Big Bob Ferguson from the Sussex Vampire. And as Holmes struggled with this telegram, Watson just didn't say anything. And Overton actually came to Baker Street and started using rugby jargon. And Holmes didn't understand. What did Watson do? He sat there in silence, allowing Holmes to struggle through this as if he were mystified as he tried to discern this foreign language. And why was it that Watson, who had full knowledge of rugby and rugby terminology, was so unhelpful in this case? Do you think it could have been that he was exacting a little bit of revenge, a little, twisting the knife, as it were, in Holmes and allowing him to twist in the wind there?
Yeah, I do think so. And, when you go and read this in The Missing Three-Quarter, it's a lovely thing to read it out loud to realize how extensive this was. This guy pops up into Baker Street and starts talking about someone Holmes or you, the reader, have never heard of. And then, he says enough to let you know that he's talking about some team because the person who's missing is clearly connected to a team. But then he goes on and says, I'd rather spare two from the pack so that I could have this guy for my three-quarter line because whether he's passing or tackling or dribbling, there's nobody who can touch him. And then when he's got the head, he holds us all together. And there's Morehouse. He's the first reserve, but he's trained as a half. And he always edges right in to the scrum instead of keeping me out on the touchline. Now, he's a fine place kick. It's true, but he doesn't have any judgment and he can't sprint. What, Morton or Johnson, the Oxford Flyers, could romp around, and Stevenson is fast enough, but he couldn't drop from the 25 line, and a three-quarter who can't punt or drop isn't worth the place. But so he's going on and on and on and on and on. And, one would think that an experienced rugby player or someone with a familiarity with the sport would have said, Holmes, you see, apparently, Holmes, what's happened here is that a fellow who plays a particular position on the team has gone missing. But no, he doesn't say anything.
This would have been one of those scenes that had the producers at Granada decided to film this story, could have been remarkable. The confusion that would have come upon Jeremy Brett's face. And then the mirth and amusement on either Edward Hardwick or David Burke's face as Watson watching Holmes, trying to figure this out. It just could have been wonderful.
Well, there's a capper too, though, in the story, because if you go on, and this tirade is over, and Watson tells us that Overton is slapping his knee and waving his hands and being very, very demonstrative in this. Holmes reaches up, stretches out his hand and takes down the letter S of his commonplace book, and he opens it up and he says, "Well, there's an Arthur Staunton who was a forger, and there was a Henry Staunton whom I helped to hang, but Godfrey Staunton is a new name to me." So that would suggest that Holmes, is completely unconnected to what this fellow has just described, doesn't even realize it's sport.
And that, after all, is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Weren't exactly sympathetic.
He doesn't come to me for sympathy.